Agriculture today, and we are joined now by Roger McEowen from K-State and Washburn University School of Law for this week's Agricultural Law Update. So thanks so much for joining us, Roger.
Good to be with you, Samantha.
Absolutely. So this week, you wanted to cover something that was recently brought to your attention. It's residual soil fertility is the broad idea.
Yeah, it's something I've been working on for quite some time. It's an issue that I've spoken on for a number of years, but it's recently been brought back to my attention by a number of practitioners back down in Texas in December, Nebraska, and Kansas, and Iowa, because there are firms that are really pushing this concept. And let me give a little background to what this is. It's known as excess or residual soil fertility, and the tax code under Section 180 does allow a deduction for soil conditioners, fertilizer, lime that you add to the property. And the concept here is if I buy farmland and I have the soil content measured and it's determined by a professional soil scientist, agronomist, that there is an excess above what average is in that area for that type of soil, then I could allocate some of my purchase price to that excess and amortize that over the useful life of that, which would probably be about 3 to 4 years based on what the agronomist would say in their report. So along with other allocations that I can make when I buy a farmland to depreciable structures such as fences and maybe a barn or a storage facility, those types of things, I can reduce my effective purchase price by being able to claim some tax deductions. So that's the theory of this. Now, the way you go about it, I.R.S. has said a couple of things over the years. Back in 1991, they put out what we call a technical advice memorandum on it, and then they also produced in the 1990s, I think it was along about 1994, what's known as a market segment specialization program paper on this, which is basically a training guide for their auditors as to this particular issue. And so we have those as professionals in the field to look at and say, okay, this is how you go about getting the deduction. You've got to have it measured. You have to have a beneficial ownership interest in the property. Have the soil test done at the time you buy the property. You don't want to wait too long because I.R.S. is not going to like that. So have the soil testing done. See if there's an excess. If there is an excess, use the soil scientist, the agronomist report to allocate value to that. And then you set it up on your depreciation schedules and claim the deduction. And usually it's about, I would say, 60% in the first year and 30% the second year, and then clean it up with the remaining 10% in year 3 is usually how this is done.
So it's a messy process, it sounds like. And this is we're talking cropland in general right now.
Yeah, it takes a lot of work. There's a cost for the soil sampling and the testing and the report that's done, obviously, and there's a cost to prepare the return to claim the deduction. But there's a procedure to go through, and the I.R.S. has blessed it as long as you follow their guidelines that they set forth in those 2 developments back in the 1990s, we can do this. But that's all the guidance that we have on it. They haven't said anything basically in 30 years with respect to it. So it can be valuable. If we're talking, for example, Iowa farmland that's $15,000 an acre, some of the most fertile land. I mean, some of that's gone most recently over $20,000 per acre. There was a tract, 120 acres, that sold actually where I'm from, where my family farms in northeast Indiana, about 20 miles east of us, that just sold for right at $20,000 per acre. And if you're able to allocate, in some instances, 20% of the value to excess soil fertility, that's a major deduction. We're talking, $5,000-$6,000 per acre that we're going to write off over 3 years. So what we're doing with all our other allocations is we're trying to drop that purchase price, my out-of-pocket cost in buying that farm, by virtue of deductions that we can claim through the tax code, and the excess fertility one can be a major one.
Sure. We're focusing on cropland right now, but when we think about the flip side of this when it comes to pasture or rangelands, is the same applicable?
Well, in theory, yes, because the code says, Section 180 of the code says that it applies also to land that is used for the sustenance of livestock. That's the code language. So that would mean your pasture land, your rangeland, your native grassland. Yeah, in theory, it applies. Now, when you apply the theory, maybe not so much, because for starters, you're starting with land that's not worth as much in terms of fair market value. So the Iowa cropland that sells for $15,000, pasture land in southern Iowa or in southwest Iowa may be $3,000 to $5,000. So you're starting at a lower level, and so any deduction based on that, based on an allocation, is going to be less, and so it's not going to be as beneficial on the tax return as if we were talking high-valued cropland that has excess fertility on it. Okay, so we start with that. Then there's the soil analysis itself. Pasture ground is not the same as crop ground, where we're adding nutrients to it, and then through the process of growing crops that take the nutrients out of the soil, then we add the nutrients back in. So that's going on all the time. With pasture ground, that's not the case. And so our phosphorus levels are different. Our nitrogen levels are different, and they're lower than what we would find with crop ground, where we're adding those nutrients to the soil. So my percentage allocation, even if there is an excess, is going to be less than the percentage allocation would be with cropland. So we start with a lower base, then we're going to have a lower percentage, and then when you actually do the math in terms of the deduction, in most instances, I think the vast majority of instances, it's not going to be worth it from an economic standpoint to go through this process to determine what your deduction might be. The deduction is not going to be worth the cost of the soil analysis, the cost of the agronomic report, the cost of the tax return preparer to prepare the return to claim the deduction. You're going to be underwater by the time you get all that done. But you will have a nice report on what your nutrient content is in your soil, but that's probably about all you're going to get.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can do that without having to go through the rest of the hoops that we just discussed. So fair point there to make, Roger. And I know that you mentioned that this is a federal code. So this is something that's, across the entire nation is something that's applicable. But there's a little bit of nuance here state to state, right?
Yeah. Some states take the position that they're not going to allow it just simply because they don't like it. And that's a personal thing in Department of Revenues from state to state. Now, most states are not like that. Most states will couple with the feds, and if you can claim it on the federal return, then they will allow it on the state return. But there are some states where simply the Department of Revenue has personnel that simply do not believe in this at all, and they put their foot down and they will disallow it on the state return. So in those states, we just take it on the federal return and ignore the state to avoid any controversy. But most of the time, we can also claim it on the state return too for state income tax purposes. But you're right, it is a federal provision. It's Section 180 of the Internal Revenue Code. I would caution listeners that there are some firms out there that do the soil testing. They're very aggressive on it, and you have to be cautious on that. Always get your tax practitioner on board early and have them engaged in the process, preferably before the sampling is done, so they can advise you on the tax ramifications of this. The last thing that we want is somebody to buy a farm, spend several $100,000 on purchasing the farm on the belief that they're going to get a large tax deduction because of excess soil fertility, and then find out later that it's not nearly as big or maybe even non-existent compared to what they thought was going to be the deduction. We don't want that to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a difference that might make you think twice before purchasing something that large.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. So, Roger, when it comes to even just law professionals, when they're thinking about advising, people in their world about this subject, what should be their first question that comes to mind?
Well, when we have a client that buys farm ground, we want to make sure that we're doing an allocation to depreciable items. This excess soil fertility or residual soil fertility, it's referred to both ways, can be a major component of that, particularly with respect to crop ground, particularly with respect to very highly productive crop ground. So we want to make sure that we make the allocation if we're able to. We don't want to miss it. It's not one we want to miss. However, we do have to follow the procedures as outlined by the I.R.S., and we have to be careful, particularly careful with its application to non-crop ground, any type of grazing land.
Absolutely. Yeah. Some great insight there today, Roger. And of course, you've written a blog post about this recently as well. So we'll link to that on Ag Manager as well as on your blog, right?
That's correct.
Absolutely. Well, Roger, thanks so much for joining us today and hopefully answering some questions out there for some listeners about, this issue of can I include this as a deduction or not? So thanks so much.
Thank you, Samantha.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State and Washburn University School of Law professor Roger McEowen joining us for this week's Ag Law Update.